Hello, this is David Ranson. The picture behind me is the University of Chicago, to which I owe so much. This is our webcast, produced in June, and we're posting it now at the beginning of July 2020. And the theme is inflation. We're proposing a better approach than what's widely in discussion to explain inflation, to diagnose it, to predict it, and even to curb it, all in one simple set of ideas. There are quite a few theories in circulation as to what is driving inflation in the US and elsewhere. Some involve money or the monetary system. Those are the ones you should look at. Explanations for inflation that don't shouldn't be taken seriously. That's because it's impossible for inflation even to exist in an economy without money. There has to be a monetary unit by which to express prices. There's no such thing as a price for anything in the absence of a monetary unit. And this is why Milton Friedman famously reminded us that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He advocated what has long been known as the quantity theory of money. That's the idea that too much money chases too few goods, as most people put it, and that is the primary source of inflation. The idea is so intuitive that it captures the minds of large numbers of economists and non-economists as well. But intuition by itself, without evidence, isn't sufficient to prove the case. There is, in fact, much more to the story, and we've been writing about this in our publications now for a long time. This webcast presents the more practical point of view that we adopted years ago at HCWE. It has sometimes been called the quality theory of money. The alternative diagnosis starts with the same basic idea that Friedman expressed, that inflation results from a cheapening of money. But it points out that excessive issuance, that is printing money, as people call it, is not the only way to devalue a medium of exchange. For example, damage done to public confidence in the monetary system can also make money cheaper. Money is supposed to be a store of value, but if you don't have confidence that its value will be maintained, then your demand for it will not be the same. And that's increasingly relevant in this age of extreme monetary policy. History is full of examples. In the classic case of a silver coin, devaluation occurs in the marketplace wherever the authorities reduce the coin's precious metal content. Over many centuries, Roman emperors and monarchs painfully discovered and rediscovered that the result is proportionate inflation. This quality theory of money is more practical because whatever the cause of money cheapening, we can measure it by monitoring the changing price that money commands in the marketplace. You could call it the market value of the dollar. We can do this regardless of whatever changes might be taking place in the quantity that's in circulation. For millennia, precious metals have served as an unquestioned standard available for valuing currencies. In the modern world, the standard of choice has usually been gold, and even today, the price of gold remains a major economic indicator for market practitioners, and that's continuing despite many decades of central bank efforts to suppress the use of gold. Actually, although the real value of gold is universally perceived as more stable than any other commodity, its constancy cannot be perfect, and that's where our recent research comes in. Our publications from the past couple of years have drawn attention to the role of gold as a safe haven during times of heightened geopolitical risk, such as the risk of the pandemic, the uncertainty. That's a very important characteristic that can temporarily make the real value of gold variable. Without getting into technicalities, let me say that this problem can be bypassed. Instead of the spot price of gold, which is susceptible to current events, we use its price in distant forward markets, which is not. My exhibit number 4 compares 3 different market-based indicators that express the market value of the dollar and might serve as leading indicators of inflation. In fact, I've used them all from time to time for that. Although often in agreement, historically, they have been giving very different signals during the current inflation surge. In terms of foreign exchange, the dollar has advanced. But in terms of gold in the spot market, it's been moving sideways. And only in terms of forward gold has it actually fallen dramatically, consistent with the inflation we're actually seeing. And the forward price of gold is the indicator advocated by HCWE. Under empirical testing, it has turned out to be historically superior to any other indicator. My next exhibit, number 5, compares the spot price of gold with its calculated price in forward markets far out into the future, as far in fact as it's possible to go with present financial markets. The two have obviously not been moving in parallel. Since late 2020, there's been no net increase in the spot price of gold. At first sight, that's anomalous, a puzzling situation in such an inflationary environment. But it has a simple explanation. It results from an abatement of pandemic anxiety. Earlier, the pandemic had driven the price of gold up, and you can see that in the left part of the chart. But the anxiety has been on the decline for a long time, pulling down the price of gold against the inflationary pressure. Now, the 30-year forward price of gold is far enough out into the future to be completely unaffected by present anxieties about pandemics or wars, whatever. And it's accordingly behaved very differently from the spot price, especially recently. Let's look at evidence documenting the link between the quality of the US dollar, measured by the forward price of gold, and inflation. It can be depicted in a number of ways and over a range of timeframes, ranging from very short to very long. I'll begin here by choosing a particularly sensitive indicator of the price level. That's the Producer Goods Index. This used to be known as the Wholesale Price Index, and it's got a history dating back to the middle of the 19th century. It's one of the most important indicators in US history. Unlike the Consumer Price Index, which is much less sensitive, it is up. The consumer price is up much more, 39% in the last 18 months, whereas the consumer price index is up only 12%. I say only 12%. 12% is very upsetting, but the actual inflation rate is much closer to what the producer price index says. My next exhibit 7 shows a strong inverse relationship between monthly inflation rates and monthly changes in the value of the dollar relative to forward gold. This graph covers the past few years. Movements in the dollar lead movements in the Producer Goods Index by about a month. The correlation is very high, 0.5, and highly significant statistically. It would be even higher were it not for the fact that there's a lot of month-to-month persistence in all of the inflation rates that the government publishes. It's weakest in the Producer Goods Index, but it's still very strong. If you take that into account, the relationship between the Producer Goods Index and the forward price of gold is even stronger and more clear. In Exhibit 8, I'm looking at lagged correlations over a multi-year time frame. These are capable of explaining inflation over a longer history. The exhibit presents evidence that the forward price of gold explains inflation over the long haul. It divides the history of annual changes into advances and declines and calculates for each group of years the average cumulative subsequent inflation several years into the future. we can see that inflation responds to the forward gold price over the longer as well as the shorter haul. The chart reveals a relationship that exists not only contemporaneously in year one, but it persists for several years into the future. Cumulative inflation, in fact, rises and rises for at least 3, maybe 4 years. John Greenwood and Steve Hanke are renowned monetary specialists, and they have recently suggested that the current inflation has been driven by unusually rapid growth in the quantity of money in circulation. Back to the quantity theory of money. They emphasized the M2 money supply as a leading indicator. Exhibit 9 analyzes both M1 and M2 as indicators of monthly inflation for the time frame 2019 to the present. There's virtually no immediate monthly relationship between inflation and either M1 or M2 growth. That's in great contrast to Exhibit 8, in which we saw the relationship with price changes in forward gold strong and very significant statistically. Puzzlingly, these results show that higher growth in either M1 or M2 leads to lower rather than higher inflation with a multi-year lag. As we reported in our research many years ago, they contradict the idea that more money in circulation is associated with a higher price level. And there is a reasonably simple explanation. The growth rate of the money supply is a function of the demand for money as well as the supply, and it tends to reflect the fact that the relationship between economic growth and inflation is inverse. So, the demand for money is positively related to growth, and growth is negatively related to inflation. Hence, the quantity of money can be negatively related to inflation. Whatever the full story, there's certainly no evidence here in this chart or any other charts I could show you to support the idea that an increase in the money supply is inflationary. So here are my key points. There are other ways to cheapen a commodity apart from increasing the amount of it available. And if we apply this idea to money, we have two measuring rods for the cheapness of money. One is the market price of the dollar relative to forward gold. The other one is the money supply. The forward gold price is a superior indicator of the cheapness of money and a good forecaster of inflation, very good. By this measure, in fact, inflation can be predicted in both the short and the longer term. An increase in the money supply, on the other hand, is not necessarily inflationary at all, and it certainly does not forecast inflation. So the problem of curbing future inflation. Well, the quality theory of money also gives a clue to the way that inflation could be stopped or prevented from recurring in the future. And that would be for the monetary authorities to be instructed to maintain a stable dollar relative to a constant monetary standard. Very different from the old idea that they should maintain a constant money supply. What we need to keep constant is the price of money. We don't have to worry about the quantity if the price is stable. It can be demonstrated that the price of forward gold can represent such a constant monetary standard. And the mechanism for doing such a thing is called a currency board. Well, currency boards are not very familiar to most people. So let me ask, what is a currency board? It's a monetary mechanism which maintains a fixed exchange rate between a domestic currency and an external currency. For example, between the euro, which we could think of as domestic currency, the euro is the external currency, and a country in the Balkans, such as Bulgaria, which I'll mention later, has a domestic currency, and the two can be tied together with a currency board. Next question, isn't that what central banks do? Well, not necessarily. Some central banks do try to keep their currency stable relative to the dollar or the euro or some other external currency, but others allow their currencies to float, and some float their currencies part of the time and stabilize them at other times. So there's no consistency. Even if a stable exchange rate is its policy, a central bank has discretion always to change it. The difference with the currency board is that the currency board has absolutely no discretion and is required to keep the exchange rate fixed. That makes it politically immune from pressure. I mentioned John Greenwood. He's the man who created Hong Kong's monetary system. Hong Kong doesn't have a central bank. Its dollar is managed by a currency board that maintains the value of the Hong Kong dollar at 7.8 to the US dollar. This fixed exchange rate has been a major source of stability to the Hong Kong economy. It's also tied Hong Kong's inflation rate to that of the United States. Another example is Bulgaria. Thanks to Steve Hanke, in part, since July 1997, Bulgaria has enjoyed the benefits of being effectively inside the Eurozone, despite having its own national currency, the lev. The value of the lev is kept at 0.51 of a euro by a currency board. Here are my conclusions then. Many economists accept that the cheapening of money is the source of inflation, but those explanations that make it into the headlines use only one version of the cheap money hypothesis, and that's known as the quantity theory of money. The idea is that money becomes cheap because of an excess quantity in circulation, printing money. But there is little or no correlation between the growth of money supply and the inflation rate. And this is especially true in the last 3 years, during which the pandemic has raged. So we have to look further. The evidence described here shows that inflation is closely correlated to the value of the dollar measured in terms of forward gold. This is visible even on a monthly basis, and it only has a short lag. There is also a lagged effect over much longer time periods as well. This version of the cheap money hypothesis suggests that we can not only explain the changing inflation rate, but predict it a month or so ahead. This quality theory of money also implies that maintaining a stable price for forward gold would preclude substantial inflation in the future. The elimination of inflation could be accomplished by creating a currency board that automatically ties the dollar to make its relationship with the price of forward gold stable. This is where we finish this webcast for this month, and I look forward to the next webcast 2 months from now. Thank you.